the sealing of the boar, a desperate gambit, and the tainting of Sidon. Good evening, and welcome to the Sleep to Lore series. Tonight, we journey back across the ages to a time of legends and myth to witness the single most cataclysmic event in the history of a world, the sealing of the boar. This is the story of how an age of unbelievable peace and progress came to a violent and tragic end, setting the stage for thousands of years of darkness and struggle. It is the story of the greatest hero of that age and his final desperate act to save everyone. If you enjoy this journey into the past and want to explore more stories from the lore of great worlds, consider subscribing to the channel or leaving a comment to let me know. Before we begin, I have a question for you. If you lived in a perfect world, a true utopia where all needs were met, what is one thing you think might still go wrong? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now, settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the sounds of your world fade away, and let us travel back across the turning of the wheel to the Age of Legends. Act Y, The Paradise Lost. To understand the tragedy, you must first understand the beauty of what was lost. The Age of Legends was not simply a time of advanced technology or great power. It was an age of fundamental peace. It was a world built on a foundation of service, cooperation, and harmony. Imagine a world without war. Not a world in a tense truce, but a world that had forgotten the very concept of nations raising armies against one another. The idea was archaic, a relic of a past so distant it was only studied by historians. There was no need for it. All needs were provided for. Sickness was a temporary inconvenience, cured by men and women who could weave the very energies of life. Hunger was a concept from a history book, for the fields and orchards produced impossible abundance, guided by those same skilled hands. Shelter was a right, not a privilege, and the cities they built were not just functional, but were themselves works of art that blended seamlessly with the natural world around them. Let us picture one such city, the crown jewel of this age, Paradisen. It was a city that seemed to rise from the earth as if it had grown there. Its towers were not of cold stone and steel, but of gleaming white material, opalescent and almost alive, that soared into the sky. They were not sharp, aggressive spires, but elegant, fluted structures that seemed to hum with a soft, internal light. They were shaped by the one power, sung into existence, their forms dictated by a perfect understanding of both aesthetics and engineering. Between these towers, great bridges arced through the air, so slender they looked as though they might shatter in a strong wind. Yet they were stronger than any stone. Great parks and green spaces were not additions to the city, but integral parts of its design. Vast trees, centuries old, grew alongside the shining towers, their leaves rustling in the clean, clear air. Waterways flowed through the city, their waters pure and sparkling, crossed by delicate bridges that seemed spun from moonlight. There was no grime, no pollution, no darkness in the corners of Paradisen. The light seemed to be everywhere, reflecting off the white towers and the clear water, filling the broad avenues and open plazas. Life for the people here was one of calm purpose. Imagine a citizen of this age waking in their home. Their window would not look out onto a crowded, noisy street, but perhaps onto a garden terrace suspended 1,000 feet in the air, where colourful birds flitted between flowers that bloomed year-round. The air would be fresh, carrying the scent of blossoms and damp earth. Their morning would not begin with a frantic rush, but with quiet contemplation or conversation. The pressures that define so much of our own lives, the worries about money, about health, about safety, were entirely absent. Instead, their thoughts would turn to their work, which was not a toil for survival, but a chosen form of service. One might be a researcher, seeking to understand the fundamental nature of the universe. Another might be an artist, shaping wood or stone or light into forms of breathtaking beauty. Another could be a grower, tending to the fields that fed the world, finding deep satisfaction in the act of creation. Travel within this city, and between the great cities of the age, was effortless. People moved through the air in vehicles called jokars. These were not loud, clunky machines. They were sleek, silent craft that rode on invisible currents of the one power. To ride in a jokar was to experience a profound sense of freedom. You could glide smoothly up the side of a gleaming tower, looking down at the intricate patterns of the plazas and gardens below. You could race along the shimmering airways that connected different parts of the city. The wind a soft whisper against the transparent canopy. There was no traffic, no congestion, just a smooth, silent and graceful dance of vehicles moving through the sky. From above, the world was a masterpiece of green and white, a testament to a society that had mastered its environment without seeking to dominate it. They lived with the world, not just on it. This deep connection to the natural world was perhaps best embodied by their relationship with the Ogier. The Ogier were a different race, not human, but ancient and wise. They were massive beings, broad and tall, with long tufted ears and faces that seemed to combine the wisdom of ages with a gentle nature. They were master builders, but their craft was not about conquering nature with stone. They were known as tree singers. An Ogier could sing to a tree, and over time, the tree would grow into the shape of a house, a living structure, complete with rooms and windows and doors, without ever harming the tree itself. To live in an Ogier-built home was to live inside a work of natural art. These homes were often found in Ogier-tended groves, places of profound peace called steading, where the trees were ancient and the air was filled with a stillness that calmed the soul. Humans were always welcome in the steading, and the Ogier often lived and worked alongside humans in their cities. Their calm and steady presence a constant reminder of the long, slow rhythms of the natural world. Their partnership was a symbol of the age, different peoples living and working together in perfect harmony, each respecting the other's strengths and wisdom. It was a world that had achieved a balance that seems almost impossible to us now. It was a paradise. But even in paradise, the seeds of its own destruction can be sown. The source of this incredible world, the engine that powered the jokars, healed the sick, and built the shining cities, was the one power. It was the fundamental energy of creation, the force that turned the wheel of time itself. The one power came from the true source, an infinite wellspring of cosmic energy. But the true source was divided into two halves, two complementary forces that worked in opposition and in concert. There was Saidin, the male half, and Saidar, the female half. They were different in nature, in feeling, in the way they were wielded. Saidin was often described as a raging, violent river of fire and earth, a torrent that a man had to seize and dominate to control, a constant battle of wills. To touch it was to feel the raw, untamed power of the universe, a power that threatened to consume you even as you used it. Saidar, the female half, was different. It was described as a vast, bottomless ocean of calm, steady power. A woman did not seize Saidar. She had to surrender to it, to open herself up to the current and guide its flow, becoming a part of the power rather than its master. In the Age of Legends, those who could channel the one power, both men and women, were known as Aes Sedai. The name meant servants of all in their old tongue, and that is what they were. They were not rulers or a magical elite. They were individuals who had been gifted with the ability to touch the true source, and they dedicated their lives to using that gift for the good of society. They were the healers, the researchers, the builders, the artists, a man and a woman, an Aes Sedai of Saidin and an Aes Sedai of Saidar could link their powers together, creating a circle where their different strengths complemented each other perfectly. The raging river of Saidin could be tamed and focused by the calm sea of Saidar, and the vastness of Saidar could be given direction and force by the driving power of Saidin. Together, they could achieve feats of creation that were impossible for either to accomplish alone. Imagine a hospital in this age. There would be no crude surgery, no harsh medicines with debilitating side effects. A patient would be brought into a quiet room, and an Aes Sedai healer would approach. The healer, perhaps a woman, would open herself to Saidar, and a soft glow would surround her hands. She would gently touch the patient, and she would not just see the injury, she would feel it. She could sense the torn muscles, the broken bones, the invading sickness, as if it were a part of her own body. Then she would begin to weave. With delicate flows of the one power, threads of spirit, air and water, she would knit the flesh back together. She would encourage the bones to mend. She would burn away the sickness with cleansing fire, all on a microscopic level. The process would be painless, even soothing. The patient would feel a gentle warmth spreading through them, a sense of peace and wholeness. Within minutes or hours, injuries that would take us months to recover from would be completely gone, leaving not even a scar. Or picture a barren desert, a vast expanse of sand where nothing could grow. The people of this age did not see it as a wasteland to be abandoned. They saw it as a challenge, a place to bring life. A team of Aes Sedai, men and women, would travel there. They would link their powers, their minds and abilities joined as one. The men would draw on the raw power of Saidin, plunging deep into the earth, drawing up vast reserves of underground water. The women, with the gentle control of Saidar, would then guide that water, creating rivers and canals where none had existed before. Others would weave flows of earth and air, breaking down the sand, enriching the soil, creating a fertile loam. They would then bring seeds, and with the power, they would encourage them to grow, bringing a lush green landscape to life in a matter of days. This was not magic in the way we think of it, as a violation of natural laws. To them, it was a deeper understanding of those laws. They were working with the fundamental forces of the universe, acting as gardeners for the entire planet. The Aes Sedai were held in the highest respect, but it was a respect born of gratitude, not fear. Their central hall, the Hall of the Servants, was not a fortress or a palace, but a place of learning and collaboration. They wore no special uniforms, save for a symbol of a circle, half white and half black, the two halves separated by a wavy line. It was the ancient symbol of the universe, of the balance between Saidin and Saidar, between male and female, between all the opposing forces that made the world turn. It was a symbol of perfect harmony, a harmony they had managed to build into their entire civilization. But within this perfection, a subtle flaw existed. It was the flaw of ambition. In a world without struggle, in a world where every problem had been solved, the greatest minds still sought new challenges, new frontiers to explore. This noble quest for knowledge, this admirable desire to push the boundaries of what was possible, would ultimately lead them to a place from which there was no return. They had mastered their world, and now they turned their gaze to mastering the very source of their power. The center of this quest for knowledge was the Kolam Dan, a great university, a city in itself dedicated to research and learning. It was a place of gleaming laboratories and vast libraries, where the most brilliant minds of the age gathered to push the boundaries of understanding. Here, there was an atmosphere of intense intellectual curiosity, and at the forefront of this community was a woman named Mirin Eronila. She was one of the most brilliant and powerful Aes Sedai of her generation, respected for her intellect and her groundbreaking research into the nature of the One Power. She was driven, ambitious, and possessed a charisma that drew others to her and her work. She was a leader in her field, and she had a grand vision. Mirin and her research team had been studying the true source for years. They understood the duality of Saidin and Saidar, but they saw it as a limitation. A man could only touch Saidin. A woman could only touch Saidar. They could work together, link their powers, but they could never truly share the same experience. Mirin theorized that there might be a third power, a different source of energy altogether, a universal power that was not divided, a power that men and women could touch and wield together as equals without the barrier of Saidin and Saidar between them. The discovery of such a power would be the greatest achievement in history. It would elevate their society from its already incredible heights to something truly transcendent. It was a noble goal, a beautiful dream. Her team worked tirelessly in a specialized research facility, a great structure that hummed with contained energies. They devised a daring experiment. Using a complex array of instruments powered by both Sidin and Sidar, they planned to probe the very fabric of the pattern, the cosmic loom that weaves all of reality. Their goal was to find a thin spot, a place where the barrier between their reality and the energy beyond was weak. They believed that if they could just drill a tiny microscopic hole, they could tap into this new unified power source. The calculations were incredibly complex. The risks were unknown, but considered manageable. In a world accustomed to success, to the steady and predictable march of progress, the possibility of catastrophic failure was not something they truly considered. They saw only the prize, the glorious new dawn their discovery would bring. The day of the experiment arrived. The research facility was sealed. Mirin and her team stood at the center of a vast chamber, the air crackling with the immense energies being drawn and focused by their equipment. The one power was flowing in immense quantities, a river of Sidin and a sea of Sidar converging on a single point in the empty air before them. The point began to shimmer, to distort. The pressure in the room became immense. The team of Aes Sedai focused their wills, their minds linked, guiding the unimaginable forces at their command. They were opening a door into the unknown. The shimmering point in the air grew brighter, more intense, until it was like a tiny star had been born in the room. Then, with a sound that was not a sound, a silent resonance that shook them to their very souls, they broke through. For a moment, there was elation. They had done it. A new energy source flowed through the opening they had created. It was intoxicating, powerful, and it felt different from the one power. It was raw, thrilling. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Mirin Eronail felt the rush of triumph. She had secured her place in history. She had given the world a gift beyond measure. But the triumph was short-lived. The energy that flowed through the hole was not clean. It was not pure. It felt cold. There was a darkness to it, a subtle taint that none of them had anticipated. They had successfully drilled a hole in the pattern, but they had not drilled into a new, clean source of power. They had drilled into a prison. They had pierced the outer shell of the prison of Shaitan, the Dark One. The Dark One was a being of pure evil and entropy, a force that existed outside of time and the pattern, sealed away by the Creator at the moment of creation. The Dark One's only desire was to break free and unmake all of existence. And now, Mirin and her team had given it a pinprick of an opening, a tiny channel through which its influence could once again touch the world. They had not opened a door to a brighter future. They had created the bore. In their hubris, in their search for a greater power, they had touched something ancient and utterly malevolent. They tried to seal the hole, to undo what they had done, but it was too late. The damage was done. The connection had been made. At first, the effects were not obvious. There was no great explosion, no immediate catastrophe. The world did not change overnight. The team at the Column Dan, horrified by what they had done, tried to cover up the extent of their failure. They reported that the new power source was unstable, too dangerous to use, and abandoned the project. They hoped, perhaps, that the tiny hole would close on its own, that the incident would be forgotten, a minor footnote in their otherwise perfect world. But the Dark One's influence was like a slow, creeping poison. It did not announce itself with thunder and lightning. It came in whispers. It seeped into the world through the bore, a subtle wrongness that began to permeate the fabric of their society. It was a corruption not of the land, but of the heart. It began in small ways, almost unnoticeable. A person might feel a flicker of intense, unreasoning jealousy towards a colleague's success, a feeling they had never experienced before. An artist might create a sculpture that, while technically perfect, evoked a sense of unease and despair in those who viewed it. An argument between friends might have a sharper, crueler edge than it should. These were small things, easily dismissed. People in this age were not accustomed to such negative emotions. They explained them away as stress or a passing mood. They did not recognize them as the first symptoms of a sickness infecting their world. The whispers from the boar grew stronger. The Dark One could now touch the minds of those who were susceptible. It did not command them. It tempted them. It found the small hidden cracks in their souls. A secret ambition, a lingering resentment, a desire for personal glory. It promised them power, not the shared power of the Aes Sedai, but personal, absolute power. It promised them immortality, an escape from the turning of the wheel. For some, these promises were too seductive to resist. People began to act more selfishly. The core philosophy of service to all began to erode, replaced by a focus on the self. Crime, a concept so alien it was almost theoretical, began to appear. A theft, an act of vandalism, then an act of violence. Each incident was a shock to this peaceful society, a ripple of disturbance that they could not quite understand. The world was still beautiful. The towers of Paran-Disen still gleamed in the sun. The Jokars still glided silently through the sky. But a shadow had fallen. It was a shadow in the hearts of the people, a growing darkness that they were unprepared to face. The perfect harmony of their age was beginning to fracture. The single, dissonant note introduced into their perfect symphony was growing louder, threatening to overwhelm the music entirely. The paradise they had built was still standing, but its foundations were rotting from within. Mierin Eronel, the brilliant researcher who had sought a brighter future, would soon fully embrace the dark power she had unleashed. She would be given a new name by the shadow, Lanfear, daughter of the night. She, and others like her, who chose personal power over service, would become the instruments of the world's undoing. The age of legends was ending, and the war of power was about to begin. The whisper from the dark was about to become a roar. Act 2. The War of Power. The world did not fall into darkness overnight. It was a slow, creeping twilight that lasted for years. The subtle wrongness that had seeped into the world through the boar began to coalesce, to find a voice and a purpose. The whispers of the Dark One were no longer random temptations. They became a focused call to the ambitious, the resentful, the proud, and the cruel. It was a promise whispered in the deepest corners of the mind, in the quiet moments of doubt. It offered an escape from the perceived mundanity of a perfect world. Why serve others when you could rule them? Why be a part of a harmonious whole when you could be the center of your own universe? Why accept the natural cycle of life and death when you could live forever, a god among mortals? For a society that had known nothing but peace and cooperation, this philosophy of absolute self-interest was a seductive and deadly poison. And so, people began to choose. They swore secret oaths in hidden places, binding their souls to the great Lord of the Dark in exchange for a measure of his power. These were not all monsters to begin with. Some were brilliant researchers who felt their genius was unappreciated. Some were artists who craved adulation above all else. Some were leaders who believed their vision for the world was superior to all others. They saw the Dark One not as a force of destruction, but as a liberator, a patron who would give them the power to achieve their desires, to remake the world in their own image. These converts formed secret societies, networks of spies and saboteurs that spread through the government, the universities, and even the Hall of the Servants. They were the Shadow's fifth column, working from within to weaken the foundations of their civilization before the first open blow was ever struck. The most powerful of these converts, the ones who possessed the greatest strength in the one power and the greatest ambition in their souls, were drawn directly into the Dark One's service. They were brought to the foot of Shayol Ghul, the mountain that stood above the physical location of the boar, a place where the veil between worlds was now terrifyingly thin. There, in the shadow of the mountain, they knelt and pledged their eternal loyalty. In return, the Dark One granted them power beyond the dreams of any other Aes Sedai. They became something more and something less than human. History would remember them by a new name, the Forsaken. There were 13 of the most powerful, and they would become the generals of the Shadow's armies, the architects of a century of terror. At their head stood the one who called himself Ishmael, betrayer of hope. In the Age of Legends, his name had been Elan Morin Tedronai. He was not a warrior or a politician. He was the foremost philosopher and theologian of his time, a man whose intellect was legendary. His mind could grapple with the most complex concepts of existence, the nature of reality, and the turning of the wheel of time. And it was this very intellect that led him to despair. He studied the cycles of history, the rise and fall of ages, and he came to a terrible conclusion. He believed that the struggle between the light and the shadow, between the Creator and the Dark One, was infinite and cyclical. He saw that in age after age, the battle would be fought, and while the light had to win every single time to preserve existence, the shadow only had to win once to unmake everything. From his perspective, the odds were impossible. The Dark One's victory was not a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty, given enough time. He saw the peace and beauty of his own age, not as a permanent achievement, but as a temporary, fragile bubble, doomed to burst. He believed that fighting for the light was a pointless struggle against the inevitable tide of cosmic entropy. His colleagues debated his theories, calling them needlessly grim, but Elan Morin saw their optimism as naivete. His despair curdled into a cold, intellectual nihilism. When the bore was opened and the Dark One's influence began to touch the world, he was not horrified. He was vindicated. He saw it as the beginning of the end he had long predicted. He travelled to Shayol Ghul not seeking power for its own sake, but to align himself with what he saw as the winning side. He chose to serve the Dark One because he believed that the ultimate fate of the universe was oblivion, and he would rather be an agent of that final, absolute end than a victim of it. He became the Shadow's greatest strategist, for he understood the hopes and fears of the light better than anyone, and he knew exactly how to crush them. Ishmael was the most terrifying of the Forsaken because his betrayal was not born of passion or greed, but of a cold, reasoned, and absolute loss of faith in existence itself. Beside him in the hierarchy of the damned stood the woman who had opened the door for them all. Mirin Eronal, now called Lanfair, the daughter of the night. Her fall to the shadow was born not from philosophical despair, but from a much more personal and fiery source, pride and spurned love. Before the bore, Mirin had been in love with the most celebrated man of the age, Lews Therin Telamon. They had been partners, lovers, two of the most powerful and respected Aes Sedai in the world. But Lews Therin had eventually turned away from her, choosing another woman to be his wife. Mirin's pride was shattered. She could not accept that anyone, especially the great Lews Therin, could find her wanting. Her love twisted into a bitter, all-consuming obsession. When she led the experiment that opened the bore, part of her motivation was to achieve something so great, so monumental, that Lews Therin would have no choice but to recognize her superiority. When the experiment proved to be a catastrophe, her pride would not allow her to accept the blame. She saw the dark power flowing from the bore not as a mistake, but as an opportunity. The Dark One whispered to her, promising her power beyond measure, the power to make Lews Therin hers forever, whether he wished it or not. She embraced the shadow with a passion that terrified even some of the other Forsaken. She did not merely serve the Dark One. She saw herself as his equal, his future queen. She coveted power not for command or conquest, but for the sake of its intoxicating, personal glory. She wanted to be adored, to be feared, to be the center of the universe. Her betrayal was a crime of passion on a cosmic scale, and her jealousy and obsession would fuel some of the most destructive acts of the coming war. She hated the world that had celebrated Lews Therin, and she would gleefully help to burn it to the ground. And then there was the one known as Demandred. He was a man who had lived his entire life in the shadow of one person, Lews Therin Telamon. In any other generation, Demandred would have been hailed as the greatest of his time. He was brilliant, a master strategist, an incredibly powerful channeler, and a charismatic leader. But in everything he did, Lews Therin was always just a little bit better. If Demandred wrote a masterful treatise on the applications of the One Power, Lews Therin would publish one that was considered more insightful a month later. If Demandred achieved a great feat of creation, the public would praise it, but they would sing songs about a greater feat Lews Therin had accomplished the year before. He was always second. Second in acclaim, second in reputation, second in the hearts of the people. This constant comparison, this lifelong rivalry that only he seemed to feel so intensely, hollowed him out. It filled him with a bitter, acidic resentment that tainted all his accomplishments. He did not hate the light or the principles of the Age of Legends. He hated Lews Therin Telamon. When the Dark One's call came, it offered him the one thing he craved above all else, a chance to finally defeat his rival. The Shadow did not care about his past achievements. It only cared about his power and his hatred. It promised him armies, command, and the opportunity to face Lews Therin on the field of battle and prove, once and for all, who was superior. He swore his oaths to the Great Lord not out of a desire for oblivion or a lust for glory, but out of a deep and personal well of hatred for one man. He would become one of the Shadow's most effective and brutal generals, his every strategic decision fueled by the burning need to erase the man whose shadow he could never escape. These three, along with 10 others, became the leaders of the New World Order. There was Agenor, the brilliant but amoral biologist who saw all life as mere clay to be molded and who would turn his genius to creating monstrous armies for the Shadow. There was Samael, another great general whose rivalry with Lews Therin festered into a murderous hatred. There was Grandal, the psychologist who mastered the art of compulsion and pleasure, turning entire nations into her willing slaves. Each of the Forsaken was a titan of the Age of Legends, a great mind or a great talent twisted and corrupted by a single, fatal flaw. Now, armed with the Dark One's power and free from all morality, they were ready to unleash a century of war upon the unsuspecting world. The whispers had ended. The time for open war had come. The first act of this war was not a battle, but an act of unimaginable terror. One of the Forsaken, it was never known for certain which, went to a major city, a beautiful place of shining towers and peaceful gardens, and in a single moment erased it from existence. Not just destroyed it, but unmade it. Where the city had stood, there was now only a smooth, glassy plain, as if nothing had ever been there. The world was in shock. This was not a crime. This was an act of impossible power, an act of pure hatred for creation itself. It was a declaration of war against reality. The Age of Legends was over. The war of power had begun. In the face of this new, terrifying threat, the world turned to the one man they believed could save them, Lews Therin Telamon. Before the war, he was the most respected and beloved figure of his age. He was not a king or an emperor. Their society had no such roles. He was known simply as the first among servants, a title that reflected his dedication to the people. He possessed a staggering level of power in Sidene, a strength that was matched only by his incredible skill and control. But he was known more for his brilliant mind, his boundless charisma, and his compassionate leadership. He was the man who could bring people together, who could solve any problem, who embodied the very best of their age. He was a man of peace, a creator, a builder, and now the world was asking him to become a destroyer. His initial reaction to the rise of the Shadow was one of disbelief. He, like many others, could not comprehend the depth of the corruption. He tried to reason with those who were swayed by the Shadow's promises, to appeal to their sense of duty and reason. He held councils, he made speeches, he tried to hold their fracturing society together through the force of his will and the power of his words. But his words were useless against the intoxicating promises of the Dark One. For every person he pulled back from the brink, 10 more fell into the abyss. The annihilation of the first city was the moment that changed him forever. It was the moment he realized that peace was no longer an option. Reason had failed. The only answer left was force. The Hall of the Servants, the global governing body of the Aes Sedai, was in chaos. They were a body designed for cooperation and research, not for waging war. They were divided, infiltrated by secret followers of the Shadow, and paralyzed by indecision. In this moment of crisis, they did what was once unthinkable. They amended their most sacred laws and granted Lews Therin Telamon supreme command of all military forces and resources. They gave him a new title, one taken from ancient prophecies. They called him the Dragon. The title was not meant as an honor. It was a burden. It was an acknowledgement that their world had entered a dark and violent age, an age that required a figure of immense power to lead them through the fire. Lews Therin, the builder, the man of peace, accepted the title and the terrible responsibility that came with it. The dragon had been born into the world, not as a savior in a time of prophecy, but as a general in a time of desperate war. The psychological toll of this transformation was immense, not just for Lews Therin, but for all the Aes Sedai who fought for the light. They had spent their lives using the one power to heal, to grow, to create. Now, they were forced to turn this fundamental force of creation into a weapon of war. Weaving flows of healing became weaving flows of destruction. Instead of knitting flesh, they were tearing it apart. Instead of raising structures, they were leveling them. Every time they channeled in battle, they were violating the very core of their philosophy. They were using the power of life to cause death. This created a deep and lasting trauma in the hearts of the Aes Sedai of the Light. They fought because they had to protect their world from something far worse, but they hated every moment of it. Lews Therin led from the front. His first battles were against armies of humans, soldiers who had sworn themselves to the Forsaken. These were horrific, bloody affairs, where Aes Sedai fought Aes Sedai, where friends and former colleagues now met across a battlefield, hurling lightning and fire at one another. Lews Therin proved to be as brilliant a general as he was a leader. His strategies were daring. His command of the one power on the battlefield was without equal. He could raise shields to protect his soldiers, vast domes of woven spirit that could withstand almost any attack. He could call down storms of lightning that would incinerate entire enemy battalions. He could split the very earth apart, opening chasms to swallow the advancing forces of the Shadow. He won battles, many of them, but for every victory, the Shadow seemed to grow stronger. For every army he defeated, 2 more seemed to rise up. He was fighting a war against an enemy that did not care about losses, that had an inexhaustible supply of souls willing to trade their lives for a taste of power. And soon, he would face armies that were not human at all. This was the masterwork of the Forsaken Aginor. In his twisted laboratories in the blighted lands near Shayol Ghul, he had begun his blasphemous experiments. Taking human and animal stock, he used a perverted form of the one power to twist and reshape them, to merge them into monstrous new forms of life. He created the Shadow Spawn. The foot soldiers of this new army were the Trollocs. They were a horrific parody of the human form, each one a monstrous blend of human and animal. They were larger and stronger than any man, standing 8 or 9 feet tall, with immense muscular bodies. Their faces were the stuff of nightmares. Some had the snouts and tusks of boars, others the beaks and feathery crests of eagles or hawks, others the horned heads of rams. They were armed with crude, heavy weapons, hooked spears and massive axes, and they fought with a savage, unthinking ferocity. They were not intelligent, but they possessed a low cunning, and they lived only for violence and to feed. The sight of a Trolloc horde charging across a field was enough to break the will of even the most seasoned soldiers. It was a wave of pure, bestial brutality. To command the Trollocs, Aginor created the Myrddraal. or fades. If the Trollocs were a parody of the human body, the Myrddraal were a parody of the human soul. They were born from the same corrupted stock, but they were different. They were tall and pale with dead white skin and black hair, and they had no eyes. Where their eyes should have been was only smooth, waxy skin, yet they could see, not with light, but in a way that was far more terrifying. They saw the world as a network of heat and movement and fear. They moved with an unnatural serpentine grace, and their speed was blinding. They wore black armor that seemed to absorb the light, and their black cloaks did not stir in any wind. A Myrddraal radiated an aura of pure terror that could paralyze a man with fear from 100 paces. They were the commanders of the Trollocs, linked to them in a way no one understood. A Myrddraal could command 100 Trollocs with its thoughts alone, and if the Myrddraal was killed, the Trollocs it controlled would often fly into a blind rage or fall dead on the spot. They were the perfect officers for an army of monsters. The war changed. It was no longer a civil war of human against human. It was now a war for the very survival of the human species against the tide of the shadow spawn. The conflict settled into a grinding war of attrition that would last for 100 years. A century of unrelenting bloodshed. Generations were born, lived their entire lives, and died, knowing nothing but the constant shadow of war. The beautiful cities of the Age of Legends, once centers of art and learning, became fortified strongholds. The vast parks and gardens were turned into defensive positions. The shining towers became watchposts. The world slowly bled. The forces of the light, led by Lews Therin Telamon, fought with incredible bravery. They developed new ways of using the One Power for war. They created powerful items, Angreal and Sa'angreal, that could magnify an Aes Sedai's power to incredible levels. They held the line against the darkness, but they were always on the defensive. The Forsaken were masters of terror. They did not seek to conquer territory in the traditional sense. They sought to break the will of the people, to extinguish all hope. They would unleash hordes of Trollocs, not just on armies, but on civilian towns and villages. They used insidious forms of the One Power to spread plagues and cause famines. They sent assassins like the Dragkar, silent, bat-like creatures whose song could drain the life and soul from a person, to pick off key leaders and healers in the night. The war was fought on every front, on the battlefield, in the minds of the people, and in the shadows of the cities. The world became a grim and desperate place. The memory of the peaceful age before the war became a distant, painful myth, a story told to children about a paradise that could never be regained. The population of the world dwindled. Great cities fell, not just conquered, but utterly destroyed. Their people slaughtered, their very stones melted by the power of the Forsaken. Imagine being a soldier in this war. You might be standing on the walls of a besieged city, the last bastion of the light in a 100-mile radius. For weeks, you have seen the enemy gathering, tens of thousands of Trollocs, a seething mass of horns and fur and steel, their guttural roars echoing across the plains. Among them, you can see the black, sightless forms of the Myrddraal, moving with chilling purpose. The sky darkens, not with clouds, but with the sheer number of Dragkar circling overhead, their faint, deadly song drifting down on the wind. Then the assault begins. The Trolloc horde surges forward, a living tsunami of rage. From the light side, the Aes Sedai on the walls unleash their power. Bolts of pure energy, like lightning, strike the charging horde, leaving massive, smoking craters. Balls of fire explode among the Trollocs, sending bodies flying. The earth itself rises up to fight, stone walls forming to block their path, the ground shaking beneath their feet. But the shadow has channelers too. From the rear of their army, one of the Forsaken, perhaps Samael, directs his own weaves. He smashes the Aes Sedai shields with hammer blows of the One Power. He carves gaping holes in the city's walls with flows of raw destruction. The Trollocs swarm through the breaches. The fighting descends into a brutal, hand-to-hand struggle. You are no longer fighting from a distance. You are face to face with a 9-foot-tall monster with the face of a boar, its tusks yellowed and sharp, its breath a foul stench of death and raw meat. You see your friends pulled down, torn apart by the savage strength of the shadow spawn. The air is filled with screams, the clash of steel, the roar of monsters, and the terrifying hum of the one power being wielded as a weapon of ultimate destruction. This scene, this nightmare, was repeated thousands of times across the world for 100 years. Hope became a scarce and precious resource. For every victory the light achieved, they suffered 2 defeats. They were slowly, inexorably being pushed back. The lands controlled by the shadow grew, a creeping blight that consumed the world. These were lands of perpetual, unnatural darkness, where the plants were twisted and thorny. The water was foul, and the very air seemed to hum with malice. The war was unwinnable. Lews Therin Telamon, the dragon, knew this. He was the greatest general in history, but even he could not defeat an enemy that had infinite resources and was led by 13 immortal, super-powered channelers who were masters of cruelty. He saw the world dying around him. He saw the faces of his soldiers, the exhaustion, the despair. He knew that if the war continued on its current path, the light would eventually be extinguished. There would be no one left to fight. The world would fall into darkness forever. It was in this moment of ultimate desperation, with the last remnants of civilization crumbling around him, that a new, radical, and terrifyingly dangerous plan began to form in his mind. A plan not just to win a battle, but to end the war in a single, desperate stroke. Act 3. The Desperate Gambit. A century is a long time to be at war. It is long enough for hope to die not once, but 1,000 times over. The world, after 100 years of the war of power, was a shattered reflection of the paradise it had once been. The gleaming white towers of the great cities were now blackened husks, scarred by fire and the destructive weaves of the one power. Many cities were gone entirely, their names little more than mournful memories whispered by the survivors. The population of the world had been decimated. Entire generations had been born into a world of conflict, had lived their lives under the constant threat of a Trolloc raid or a Fade's blade in the night, and had died without ever knowing a single day of true peace. The very land seemed to mourn. The blight, the creeping corruption that spread out from Shayol Ghul, had consumed vast territories, turning fertile plains into toxic, thorny wastelands where monstrous and twisted things hunted in the perpetual twilight. Even in the lands still held by the light, the sky often seemed a duller grey, the sun a little less bright. Fear was a constant companion. It was in the air the people breathed, in the food they ate, in the worried glances they exchanged in the fortified streets. The psychological toll on the forces of the light was immense. Soldiers who had once been farmers and artists were now grim, hardened veterans, their eyes holding the ghosts of 100 battles. The Aes Sedai, who had once been healers and builders, were now weapons. The act of channeling the one power, once a joyous connection to the source of life, had become a grim necessity of death. They were tired. They were all so profoundly tired. The war had ground on for so long that the idea of victory seemed like a child's fantasy. The best they could hope for was to survive another day, to hold the line for one more week, to push the darkness back just a few more miles, knowing it would inevitably surge forward again. The resources of the light were dwindling. For every powerful channeler they lost in battle, there was no one to replace them. The shadow, however, seemed to have an endless supply of monsters and fanatics. They were losing a war of attrition, and everyone knew it. At the center of this storm of despair stood Lews Therin Telamon, the dragon. The burden he carried was greater than any other. For 100 years he had led the armies of the light. He had planned the strategies, commanded the battles, and watched thousands of his friends and followers die. The weight of every loss settled on his shoulders. The face of every soldier who fell under his command was etched into his memory. He was the symbol of their resistance, the unwavering beacon of hope in a world drowning in darkness. But in the quiet hours of the night, when he was alone with his thoughts, the hope he projected to the world felt thin and brittle. He saw the map in his command tent, the vast swathes of territory lost to the shadow, the shrinking pockets of land they still desperately held. He saw the casualty reports, the numbers that were more than just statistics, each one a life extinguished, a family shattered. He knew, with the cold certainty of a master general, that they could not win. Not like this. They could fight for another year, another decade, perhaps even another century. But in the end, they would be overwhelmed. The shadow only needed to win once. The light had to win forever, and their forever was running out. It was from this place of absolute desperation that a new kind of thinking began to emerge. The strategy of holding the line had failed. The strategy of trying to reclaim lost territory had failed. A new approach was needed, something radical, something that could change the fundamental nature of the war itself. The problem was not the Trolloc armies or the Myrddraal commanders. They were merely symptoms of the disease. The disease was the boar itself, the wound in the pattern that allowed the Dark One's influence to poison the world and his power to fuel the Forsaken. As long as the boar remained open, the war would never end. The Dark One would always be able to touch the world, to corrupt new followers, to empower his chosen generals. The solution, then, was not to win the war, but to end it. They had to seal the boar. This single idea, born of desperation, became the last flickering hope of a dying world. But how to do it? To approach Shayol Ghul, the heart of the Dark One's power on Earth, was to walk into the mouth of the beast. It was a suicide mission. And even if one could reach the boar, how could a hole in the fabric of reality be patched? Two great plans emerged from the beleaguered Hall of the Servants, and the debate between them would tear the forces of the light apart, creating a schism that would echo through the rest of history. The first plan was the brainchild of an Aes Sedai named Latra Posai Dekum. She was a woman of immense intellect and power, known for her calm demeanor, her meticulous planning, and her deeply cautious nature. Where Lews Therin was a figure of fiery action and battlefield brilliance, Latra Posai was a creature of logic and careful consideration. She had watched the war unfold, had seen the reckless gambles and the devastating costs, and she believed that another headlong charge into the fire was not the answer. Her approach was rooted in the old philosophies of the Aes Sedai: balance, defense, and the use of both halves of the one power working in harmony. She looked at the boar not as a gate to be slammed shut, but as a wound to be cleansed and covered. Her plan was breathtaking in its scale and ambition, a project that would be the single greatest act of creation in the history of the world, undertaken in the midst of its greatest war. Her proposal centered on the creation of two colossal Sangreal, the most powerful artifacts for focusing the one power that could possibly be conceived. One would be keyed to Sidin for men to use, and the other to Saidar for women. They were to be called the Chodian Kal. These would not be small items, like the staffs or wands that some Aes Sedai used. They would be massive spheres, perfectly formed, one of alabaster white, and the other of shining black, each larger than a house. They would be so powerful that no single channeler, or even a circle of channelers, could use them safely from anywhere on the planet. To protect the wielders, two smaller access keys, statues of a man and a woman holding the spheres, would also need to be created. A circle of the most powerful male Aes Sedai would link and pour Sidin into their Sa'angreal from a safe distance, while a circle of the most powerful female Aes Sedai would do the same with Saidar. The two great spheres themselves would be placed in orbit around the planet, positioned in a precise configuration. When the power was channeled into them through the access keys, the Chodian Kal would project a vast network of the one power, a protective screen that would cover the entire globe. This screen, woven from the purest essence of both Sidin and Saidar in perfect balance, would not attempt to seal the boar directly. Instead, Latra Posai theorized, It would act as a filter. It would allow the true source to continue powering the wheel of time, but it would block the Dark One's specific, corrupting influence from passing through the bore. It would effectively quarantine the Dark One, cutting him off from the world and from his followers. The Forsaken would lose the source of their enhanced power. The Shadow Spawn armies, creations of that power, might wither and die. The war would end not with a bang, but with a slow suffocation of the enemy. Latra Posai presented her plan to the assembled Aes Sedai at the Hall of the Servants. Her voice was calm and steady as she laid out the intricate details. She argued that her plan was the safest path forward. It was a defensive measure, an act of shielding and protection, which aligned with the true purpose of the Aes Sedai. It utilized both men and women, Saidin and Saidar, working together in the balanced way they were always meant to. It did not require a direct suicidal assault on Shayol Ghul. It was elegant, it was thorough, and it was, in her view, the only sane option left. She acknowledged the difficulties. Creating the Chodian Kal would be an immense undertaking, requiring the work of thousands of channelers and artisans for years, perhaps even decades. It would consume a vast amount of their already strained resources. They would have to defend the secret construction sites from the Shadow's attacks for the entire duration of the project. It was a slow, difficult path, but, she argued, it was a sure one. It was a plan that prioritized the preservation of life and the restoration of balance over a quick, bloody, and uncertain victory. Many in the hall, especially among the female Aes Sedai, listened to her words and felt a sense of relief. It was a plan that felt right. A plan that felt like a return to their true selves after a century of being forced to be warriors. Then, Lews Therin Telamon rose to speak. The dragon. He stood before the assembly not as a politician or a theorist, but as a general who had just come from the front lines. His face was etched with exhaustion and grief. His eyes held the fire of a man who had stared into the abyss and was determined to drag the world back from its edge. He listened to Latra Posai's plan with respect, but when he spoke, his voice was filled with a terrible, desperate urgency that cut through the calm logic of her proposal. He looked at the faces of his fellow Aes Sedai, and he told them the brutal truth. They did not have decades. They did not have years. He told them of the latest defeats, of the collapsing fronts, of the cities that were on the verge of falling. He described the dwindling number of soldiers, the growing power of the Shadowspawn armies. He painted a grim picture of their reality, a reality that could not afford the luxury of a long and careful plan. "We are dying," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "While we spend 20 years building your magnificent filter in the sky, the world it is meant to protect will have already been devoured." He then presented his own plan. It was the complete opposite of Latra Posai's. It was not defensive. It was a pure, all-or-nothing attack. It was not slow and careful. It was a lightning strike, a desperate gambit to end the war in a single day. His plan was simple in its concept, but terrifying in its execution. He proposed to gather a strike force of the most powerful male channelers he could find. They would not engage the main armies of the Shadow. They would use their power to travel directly to the slopes of Shayol Ghul itself, to the physical location of the bore. They would punch a hole through the Shadow's defenses and go straight for the heart. Lews Therin, as the strongest channeler of his age, would be the focal point. He would draw on an immense amount of Saidin, shielded and supported by his companions. He would then use that power not to create a filter, but to forge a patch. He had commissioned the creation of 7 seals. These were small, disc-like objects made of a near-indestructible material called Quendiyar, or heartstone. They were designed to be focus points. At the critical moment, Lews Therin would pour a torrent of the One power through these 7 seals, weaving a complex net of Saidin, and slam that net directly into the bore. The seals would anchor the patch, plugging the hole in the pattern like a cork in a bottle. It would sever the Dark One's connection to the world completely and instantly. It would be a final, absolute and immediate end to the war. The risks, he admitted, were astronomical. The assault on Shayol Ghul would be a near-suicidal endeavor. They would be at the center of the enemy's power, facing the full might of the Forsaken on their home ground. The amount of the one power that needed to be wielded would be staggering, far beyond what had ever been attempted before. The slightest miscalculation could result in the death of everyone involved and the immediate victory of the Shadow. And, he acknowledged, no one knew what the Dark One might do in that final moment, as his prison was being reinforced. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous. But, Lews Therin argued, it was a risk they had to take. Their slow death was a certainty. His plan offered at least a chance, however slim, of survival. It was a soldier's plan, audacious, direct, and incredibly dangerous. The Hall of the Servants was thrown into turmoil. The two plans represented two completely different philosophies, two opposing views of the world. The debate that followed was not calm or reasoned. It was bitter, emotional, and deeply personal. It became known as the Great Schism. The followers of Latraposai accused Lews Therin of arrogance and recklessness. They called his plan a madman's dream, a final, glorious charge that would accomplish nothing but get the last of their powerful male channelers killed. They pointed out that his plan relied solely on Sidon, the male half of the power. They saw this as the ultimate expression of male arrogance, an attempt to solve the world's greatest problem without the balance and wisdom of Saidar. They argued that such an unbalanced weaving, so close to the source of the Dark One's power, was profoundly dangerous and could have consequences that no one could predict. They saw it as an act of hubris, a general who had fought for so long that he could only think in terms of attack and destruction, forgetting the Aes Sedai's true purpose of creation and preservation. They pleaded for the path of patience, of cooperation, of balance. Lews Therin's supporters fired back with equal passion. They accused Latraposai and her followers of cowardice and naivete. They called her plan a scholar's fantasy, a beautiful theory that completely ignored the bloody reality of their situation. They accused her of being willing to sacrifice the last generation of humanity on the altar of her cautious principles. "Balance is a luxury we can no longer afford," one of his supporters shouted during a heated debate. "You speak of decades, while our children are being slaughtered by Trollocs today." They argued that the men were the ones who had done the majority of the fighting and dying on the front lines, and they had earned the right to choose the strategy that would finally end the bloodshed. They saw the female Aes Sedai's reluctance not as wisdom, but as a failure to grasp the true desperation of their plight. They saw Lews Therin's plan not as reckless, but as the only courageous and realistic option left. It was a choice between a slim chance of life and the certainty of a slow, agonizing death. The schism was not just about strategy. It cut to the very heart of the relationship between men and women, between Saidin and Saidar. The unity of the Aes Sedai, the foundation upon which their entire civilization had been built, was cracking under the immense pressure of the war. Friendships that had lasted for centuries were broken. Respect turned to suspicion, and cooperation turned to bitter opposition. The men saw the women as obstructionist and timid. The women saw the men as arrogant and dangerously aggressive. The perfect balance of the ancient symbol had been shattered. Finally, a decision had to be made. Lews Therin, as the commander-in-chief, had the authority to proceed with his plan, but he needed the support of the Hall, especially the powerful female channelers, to have any real chance of success. Latraposai Dekume, speaking for the majority of the female Aes Sedai, gave him their final answer. They would not support his plan. They formally refused to participate in what they considered a suicidal and unbalanced attack. They would instead dedicate their remaining resources to the long-term project of creating the Chodian Khal, their own hope for the world's salvation. It was a devastating blow. Lews Therin had been abandoned. He stood before the hall, the weight of the world on his shoulders, and saw that he was truly alone. The unity of the Aes Sedai was broken forever. The women would go their way, and he would go his. His face was a mask of grim determination. If he had to save the world alone, then so be it. He turned his back on the hall of the servants and walked out, leaving the fractured assembly to their debates and their long-term plans. He knew there was no time left. He sent out a call, not to the hall, but to the men on the front lines, the soldiers who had fought and bled alongside him for a century. He called for volunteers for a final, desperate mission. He asked for the strongest male channelers left alive, the ones who understood the stakes and were willing to risk everything for one last chance at a future. They came. From every remaining bastion of the light, they came. They were weary, battle-scarred men, the last of the great male Aes Sedai of the Age of Legends. There were 113 of them in total. History would remember them as the 100 Companions, though there were more than 100. They gathered at a secret staging ground, a place far from the political wrangling of the hall. The atmosphere was not one of glorious preparation for battle. It was somber, heavy with the knowledge of what they were about to do. These men were saying goodbye to the world. They knew the chances of survival were almost zero. They wrote final letters to the families they had left, to the loved ones they would never see again. They looked at each other, seeing the same grim resolve in every face. They were not fanatics seeking martyrdom. They were exhausted soldiers who had been given one last, impossible order, and they were determined to see it through. They put their faith not in a plan, but in a man. They trusted the dragon. Lews Therin stood before them, his heart heavy but his voice clear and strong. He did not promise them victory. He did not promise them glory. He promised them only a chance to end the suffering, a chance to give the world a future, even if they would not live to see it. He looked at the faces of these brave men, his companions in the final desperate act, and he felt a profound sense of both gratitude and sorrow. Then, the time for words was over. Lews Therin raised his hands, and the full power of Saidin, the raging river of the male half of the true source, answered his call. He and his companions joined their powers together, 114 men forming a circle of unimaginable force. They did not march to war. They did not travel by any conventional means. They seized the very fabric of the pattern, and with a single, coordinated act of will, they traveled. They tore a gateway through reality, stepping from their staging ground directly into the heart of the enemy's domain. They appeared on the barren, ash-strewn slopes of Shayol Ghul. The sky above was a permanent, churning vortex of black and purple clouds, lit by flashes of unnatural lightning. The air was freezing cold, and it tasted of dust and despair. The very ground seemed to cry out in agony. This was a place where the blight was at its strongest, a place where reality itself was thin and warped. And at the peak of the mountain, they could feel it. The bore. It was not something that could be seen with the eyes, but it could be felt in the soul. It was a sucking void, a wound that radiated a palpable aura of pure evil and coldness. The moment they arrived, the forces of the shadow reacted. Hordes of Trollocs and Murdral surged up the mountainside to meet them, a tide of shrieking, monstrous fury. From the dark fortress at the peak, the Forsaken themselves emerged, their power lashing out, seeking to annihilate the intruders. The final battle had begun. The 100 companions formed a protective circle around Lews Therin, their bodies a living shield against the onslaught. They were vastly outnumbered, but they were the most powerful channelers of their age. They unleashed a storm of destruction upon the Shadow's armies. They erected domes of shimmering air that vaporized any Trolloc that touched them. They called down pillars of fire from the roiling sky, incinerating entire battalions of shadow spawn. They fought back to back, a small island of light in an ocean of darkness, their faces illuminated by the brilliant, deadly light of the one power they wielded. Men fell. The cost was horrific. For every 100 Trollocs they killed, another companion would be struck down by a weave from a hidden Forsaken, or torn apart by a flanking Murdral. But they held the line. They were buying time. Inside the circle, Lews Therin Telamon was engaged in the true battle. He was not fighting the shadow spawn. He was wrestling with the universe. He drew on Saidin, pulling more of the one power into himself than any man had ever dared to before. The ground around him cracked and glowed with the raw energy. His body was a conduit for a force that could unmake continents. He was a living star of pure power. He took the 7 Quendilar seals, and one by one, he began to weave the final intricate pattern. It was a weave of immense complexity, a net of pure energy designed to patch a hole in creation itself. The pressure was unimaginable. The Dark One's own power pushed back against him from the bore, a force of pure negation that sought to unravel his mind and his weaves. He could feel the whispers in his head, promises of power, threats of eternal torment. He ignored them all. He focused his entire being, his every ounce of will and strength, on the single desperate task before him. His companions were dying around him, their lives the price for every second he needed. He could feel their life forces extinguishing one by one, but he could not falter. He was the dragon, and this was his final desperate roar, a gambit to save the world, or to break it in the trying. Actum 4. The Tainted Victory. The battle on the slopes of Shayol Ghul was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a singular moment of cosmic confrontation, a focal point where the fate of the world was balanced on the will of a single man. Around Lews Therin Telamon, the world was a screaming vortex of chaos. His 68 surviving companions formed a desperate living wall against the tide of darkness. They fought with the raw, untamed power of Saidin, and the very mountains shuddered under the force of their weavings. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt flesh, a hellish landscape illuminated by the constant blinding flashes of the one power being used to kill. Men shouted, monsters roared, and above it all was the sickening, soul-draining hum of the boar, the wound in reality that they had come to close. But for Lews Therin, all of that was a distant storm. His entire universe had shrunk to the task at hand. He was a conduit, a living channel for a river of power so immense it threatened to tear his body and mind to ashes. The raw energy of Saidin surged through him, a torrent of liquid fire and grinding stone that he had to master, had to bend to his will, lest it consume him utterly. His muscles screamed in protest. His bones felt as if they were vibrating apart, and a roar of pure, untamed energy filled his ears, drowning out the sounds of the battle around him. He held the 7 Quendilar seals, and they felt cold in his hands, anchors of reality in a sea of chaos. He focused his mind, pushing past the pain, past the exhaustion, past the grief for the companions he could feel dying around him. He had to weave. He began to pull the threads of Saidin, not to strike or to defend, but to mend. It was the most complex weave ever attempted, a pattern of such intricacy that it made the finest tapestries look like a child's scrawl. He was weaving a patch for the skin of the universe. The Dark One fought back. It was not a physical assault, but a mental one. As Lews Therin wove, the Dark One's essence poured from the bore, a tide of pure negation that sought to unmake his work and his sanity. Whispers slithered into his mind, promises of power that would make his current strength seem like a flickering candle. He was offered the world, the universe, the chance to rule beside the great lord as his equal. He was shown visions of his wife, Ilyena, her face twisted in fear, her life threatened if he did not cease. He was shown images of his own failure, of the world burning, of his friends dying in agony, all because of his arrogance. The whispers sought to find the cracks in his will, the seeds of doubt, the whispers of pride. They were insidious, twisting his love and his duty into weapons to be used against him. He felt his focus waver, his grip on the raging torrent of Saidin begin to slip. The weave flickered, threatening to unravel. It was the memory of a quiet afternoon, a lifetime ago, that saved him. A memory of sitting in a garden with Ilyena, the sun warm on their faces, the scent of flowers in the air, a memory of peace. That was what he was fighting for, Not for glory, not for power, not for the title of dragon. He was fighting for the chance for someone, somewhere, to have a peaceful afternoon in a sunlit garden again. The memory became his shield. He poured his love for his wife, his children, his world into the weave. He strengthened his will, shut out the whispers, and pulled on the power with a final, desperate surge of strength. The weave solidified. The net of pure Sidin, anchored by the 7 seals, flared into existence, a construct of blinding white light. It was a perfect, intricate pattern of pure law and order, designed to hold back the ultimate chaos. With a final, silent roar of effort that was felt rather than heard, Lews Therin Telamon slammed the patch into place. For a single, eternal moment, there was a profound and absolute silence. The screaming of the Trollocs, the clash of weapons, the roar of the one power, all of it vanished. The oppressive, soul-crushing pressure emanating from the boar ceased. The very air on the mountainside seemed to become clean, the freezing cold replaced by a sudden, neutral stillness. The battle was over. They had won. The surviving companions, their numbers now tragically few, lowered their hands, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They looked at each other, their faces streaked with blood and grime, and a slow, dawning sense of disbelief and triumph began to spread among them. They looked to Lews Therin, who stood, swaying, at the center of their circle. He had done it. The dragon had done the impossible. The boar was sealed. The war was over. A weak, ragged cheer went up from the men. They had paid an unimaginable price, but they had saved the world. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated victory, a single perfect second of hope fulfilled against all odds. And it was in that perfect second of triumph that the Dark One, in its final act of spite from behind its newly reinforced prison wall, struck its last and most terrible blow. It was not a blow against the world. It was not an attack on Lews Therin's body. It was a counterstroke aimed at the very weapon his enemies had used to defeat him. As the seal slammed shut, in the last infinitesimal fraction of a second before the connection was severed, the Dark One unleashed a wave of its own essence, a concentrated blast of pure evil, rage, and insanity. This wave of filth did not travel through the air. It traveled up the stream. It poured directly into the true source, into the male half of the one power. It was a poison injected into the river of Sidin itself. In that moment, everything changed. Lews Therin and his companions were still connected to Sidin, still holding the power they had used to seal the boar. They were the first to feel it. The feeling was not one of pain. It was one of violation. Imagine drinking from a cool, clear spring, and in mid-swallow, the water turns to oily, greasy filth in your mouth. The pure, clean fire of Sidin that they had wielded their entire lives was suddenly, horribly corrupted. A greasy, black foulness now coated every thread of the power they held. It felt slick and rotten, and it carried with it the very essence of the Dark One's madness. It was a spiritual poison, an acid that burned not the body, but the soul. The triumph on their faces turned to confusion, then to horror. They tried to let go of the source, to sever the connection, but it was too late. The taint had already touched them, had already begun to seep into their minds. A wave of nausea and vertigo swept over the men on the mountainside. The world seemed to tilt and spin. The clean air of a moment before now smelled of decay and corruption. The whispers started, not the clear, tempting whispers of the Dark One from the boar, but a new kind of sound. A babble of insane voices, screaming and laughing at the edges of their hearing. They saw things in the corners of their vision, fleeting shadows, faces contorting into monstrous shapes. The taint was a creeping paranoia, a madness that clawed at the edges of their sanity. The man standing next to you, your friend who had just fought and bled beside you, suddenly looked different. His eyes seemed to glow with a malevolent light. His smile seemed like a predator's snarl. Was he really your friend, or was he one of them? A trick, a servant of the shadow in disguise. The trust and camaraderie that had held them together in the face of annihilation was shattered in an instant, replaced by a festering, insane suspicion. One of the companions screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He pointed a trembling finger at the man next to him, his face a mask of horror, and unleashed a torrent of the one power. The man he struck, his friend of 200 years, was obliterated in a flash of light. The act of violence broke the dam. The fragile control of the surviving companions shattered completely. The madness took them. They were the most powerful men in the world, filled with the tainted, maddening power of Sidin, and their reason was gone. They turned on each other. The slopes of Shayol Ghul, the site of their greatest victory, became a madhouse of horrors. Men who had just saved the world together now tore each other apart with the very power that had won the day. Weaves of destruction, meant for Trollocs and Fades, were now unleashed on former comrades. The last heroes of the light died screaming, killing their friends, their minds filled with insane visions and paranoid delusions. Lews Therin, at the epicenter of the blast, was hit the hardest. His mind, which had just withstood the direct assault of the Dark One, was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The victory, the sacrifice, the memory of his purpose, it all vanished, replaced by a swirling chaos of fear and rage. He saw the faces of his dying companions, but he did not see friends. He saw demons. He saw the face of Ishmael, the betrayer of hope, laughing at him. He saw the leering visages of all 13 Forsaken. He was surrounded by his enemies. He reacted as a soldier, as the dragon. He lashed out with a cataclysmic surge of power, a storm of fire and lightning that scoured the mountainside, incinerating friend and foe alike. He stood alone amidst the smoking ruin of his own victory, laughing and weeping, his mind a ruin. The sealing of the boar was a success, but the price was the sanity of every male channeler who had participated. Their victory was tainted, and now, through them, the world would be broken. This was only the beginning. The madness on Shayol Ghul was a prelude. The surviving male Aes Sedai, who had not been part of the strike team, men all over the world, soon felt the change. The next time they reached for the one power, they too felt the oily slickness, the foul corruption clinging to the source of their strength. For some, the madness came instantly, a sudden, catastrophic break with reality. For others, it was a slow, creeping disease. It started with headaches and a feeling of unease when they channeled. Then came the paranoia, the whispers at the edge of hearing. They would see plots and betrayals where there were none. Their tempers would grow short, their actions erratic. Over weeks or months or even years, the taint would eat away at their sanity, rotting their minds from the inside out until nothing was left but a madman wielding the power of a god. And with that power, they would bring about an age of destruction that would make the war of power look like a minor skirmish. This was the beginning of the breaking of the world. The men who went mad were not simply dangerous. They were the most powerful beings of their age, and their insanity was expressed through the one power. Imagine a man who had been a great artist, a sculptor who could shape stone with his will. In his madness, he might see a flaw in the shape of a mountain range. He would travel there, and with a wave of his hands, he would raise new peaks, jagged and impossible, shattering the Earth's crust for 1,000 miles. He would not be doing it out of malice. In his broken mind, he was fixing a mistake. He was creating a new masterpiece. But in the process, he would cause earthquakes that would swallow cities whole. Imagine another, a man who had loved the oceans, who had studied the currents and the tides. In his madness, he might become terrified of the dark depths. He would wade into the sea, drawing on the tainted Sidin, and he would begin to boil the water away. The seas would recede, creating vast, steaming salt flats where there was once a thriving coastline. The climate of the entire planet would be thrown into chaos. He would think he was making the world safe, bringing light to the darkness. But he would be destroying the very ecosystem of the planet. Another, haunted by visions of the war, might see shadow spawn everywhere. He would see a peaceful farming village, and in the faces of the children, he would see the snarling masks of Trollocs. In the name of protecting them, he would scour the entire valley with cleansing fire, leaving nothing but blackened glass and the memory of screams. This was the nature of the breaking. It was not a coordinated campaign of destruction. It was a random, chaotic, and insane apocalypse, driven by the shattered minds of the world's most powerful men. For centuries, this terror reigned. Civilization collapsed. There was no safe place. At any moment, a male Aes Sedai, his mind finally broken by the taint, could appear in the sky above your town and, in a fit of insane rage or misguided creation, wipe it from the face of the earth. Continents were shattered and reformed. Mountain ranges were raised where there had been plains. Seas were drained where there had been thriving ports. The very geography of the world was torn apart and stitched back together into a new, unfamiliar shape. The survivors of this cataclysm were few. They hid in caves, in the deep forests, in the ruins of their former cities, living a desperate, terrified existence. They were not hiding from armies. They were hiding from the insane, godlike men who had once been their greatest protectors. The Age of Legends was not just over. It was being systematically erased from the world. And what of the dragon, Lews Therin Telamon? He, the most powerful of them all, was the most tragically and catastrophically insane. After the slaughter on Shayol Ghul, he vanished for a time, but then he reappeared, his mind lost in a labyrinth of paranoia and delusion. He travelled not in a physical sense, but by stepping through gateways he created in the pattern, his madness guiding him. He was searching for his family, for his home, for a place of safety in a world that his mind perceived as being completely overrun by the shadow. And he found it. He appeared in his own palace, a place of beauty and peace that had been shielded from the worst of the war. There, his wife, Ilyena, and his children were waiting, hoping against hope for his safe return. Ilyena saw him appear in the great hall, and for a moment her heart soared with relief. He was alive. He was home. She ran to him, her arms outstretched, calling his name. But as she drew closer, she saw the look in his eyes. It was not the warm, loving gaze of her husband. It was the wild, hunted look of a cornered animal, a look of pure, unreasoning madness. He did not see his wife. In his taint-addled vision, he saw the face of the forsaken Samael, his hated rival, coming to attack him. He did not hear her words of love. He heard taunts and threats. The children ran towards him, calling him father, and he saw not his beloved son and daughter, but dark, twisted figures, minions of the shadow sent to destroy him. In his mind, his home had been infiltrated by his greatest enemies. He was the dragon. He had to protect his family. He had to destroy the intruders. He unleashed the one power. The act was quick. He was, after all, the most powerful channeler in the world. In his madness, he was a force of nature. He killed them all. His wife, his children, his entire household, everyone he had ever loved. He slaughtered them in the name of protecting them. When it was over, he stood in the silence of his ruined palace, amidst the bodies of his family, and a new voice cut through the babble of his madness. It was not the Dark One. It was a man, appearing from a gateway of shadow. It was Elan Moren Tedronai, the Forsaken known as Ishamael. Unlike the others, Ishamael had not been fully trapped by the seal. His connection to the Dark One was different, allowing him to be spun out into the world, half in and half out of the prison, to plague the world for the ages to come. He looked at the devastation Lews Therin had wrought, and he did not mock or gloat. He showed him. With a touch of the true power, the energy drawn directly from the Dark One, Ishamael granted the insane dragon a single, horrifying moment of perfect lucidity. The madness fell away. The visions vanished. The whispers ceased. And Lews Therin saw. He saw the bodies of his children, their small forms still and broken. He saw the face of his beloved Ilyena, her eyes open and empty, her blood staining the stones of the home they had built together. He saw what he had done. He remembered their names, their laughter, the feel of their hands in his. And the grief that washed over him was an ocean of fire, a pain so absolute and all-consuming that it dwarfed even the power he could wield. The scream that tore from his throat was a sound of pure, soul-shattering anguish. It was the sound of a man who had saved the world only to personally destroy his own. Ishmael, his work done, healed the dragon's mind, leaving the sanity in place so that he would have to live with the full weight of his crime for the rest of his life. Lews Therin Telamon, the dragon, the saviour of the world, now known forever as the Kinslayer, could not bear it. He fled from his home, from the sight of what he had done. He travelled to a deserted stretch of countryside. He would not allow himself to simply die. His death had to mean something, to serve as a warning. He drew on Sidene, the tainted, filthy power that had driven him mad and caused him to murder his family. But this time, he did not try to control it. He opened himself up to it completely, drawing more and more, an amount of the one power that no physical body could ever hope to contain. He drew it all into himself, the power and the taint, until his body began to glow with a light brighter than the sun. And then he unleashed it all in a single volcanic eruption. The land for miles around was vaporized. The earth heaved and buckled, and a single massive mountain was thrust up towards the sky, a black, jagged peak that would stand for thousands of years. It would be known as Dragon Mount, the funeral pyre of the dragon. He had paid for his victory with his life, his sanity, and his soul. The breaking of the world did not end with his death. It would continue for centuries, a long, slow, grinding apocalypse. When the dust finally settled, the world was unrecognizable. The Age of Legends was a forgotten myth. The survivors huddled in new cities with new names, their knowledge of the past lost and fragmented. And the legacy of Lews Therin's desperate gambit remained. The bore was sealed, but Sidon was forever tainted. From that day forward, any man who could channel the one power was doomed. He was a danger to himself and to everyone around him. He was a walking tragedy, destined to one day go mad and die, destroying everything he loved in the process. The female Aes Sedai, now based in their new city of Tar Valon, would take it upon themselves to police this new, broken world. They would hunt down the men who could channel, gentling them, severing their connection to the one power to prevent them from going mad and causing another breaking. It was a mercy, but a cruel one. The two halves of the power were now enemies. The perfect circle was broken. The world had been saved, but it was a wounded, fearful world, living under the shadow of a victory that had cost it everything. And it would wait for 3,000 years for the dragon to be born again, to face the Dark One when the seals inevitably weakened, and to pray that this time the world would not have to be broken to be saved.